So today we're going to carry on the third segment in our After the Collapse, and this will be about food. Now, we're going to touch a little bit on what you can take with you initially. Some things you'll want to try to take in the greatest amount of bulk you can possibly carry, other things maybe not so much. As we've stated before, we also want to have enough material, enough food with us for that transition period from the time we have to leave until we can get settled in and start procuring food from natural sources. So you're going to need a certain amount of food, and depending on where you live and the circumstances and the weather, that may vary from not very much food to quite a significant amount. So let's get started. First, we are probably most of us familiar with these are the freeze-dried foods that you can buy. I have probably 20 or 25 of these, mostly because I got them at a ridiculously good deal. There doesn't even appear to be an expiry date on this, and just a lot number. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but sometimes that indicates a ton of chemicals, but generally these are freeze-dried, so that's probably what it is. The major disadvantage with these, now this says, before I get into that, this says that that's 3 servings. So, I don't know. When it reconstitutes, it constitutes a lot bigger, I know that. So it could very well be 3 servings. If you're out in the bush and you're traveling through rough country and all those types of things, you may, you'll generally get a bigger appetite, so that might be 2 servings. But either way, these things are 10 or 12 bucks most of the time, depending on where you get them and when. So as much as they're handy, and it's not a bad idea to have a few of them, they're pretty costly, and that's the single biggest disadvantage. They come in a lot of different flavors, different foods. This one is Cajun beans and rice. There's several other ones that I have in different flavors. Some of them are even desserts. So that's a good option, but again, it's pretty pricey. This is a rock that was just the way it was when I found it. Just nice, smooth little rock. It's kind of nothing fancy. It's just a little disc, but it makes a dandy heating rock. I normally won't use it in a kuksa, but you could heat that up in the fire if you had some water in here. Take the spoon out and just put it in there, and that rock is big enough, if you get it hot enough, to very easily heat this amount of water. Normally I would use that more in a little birch bark container that I would have made. Now, here's something that most people don't realize, but you can actually take a birch bark container when you fold it up so that it's watertight. Just set that away. And you can put that directly onto the coals of the fire, as long as the fire, hopefully not too much flame, mostly coals, but as long as the flame doesn't come up above the level of the liquid in the birch bark, it will scorch. It won't last too many times. You can use it once or twice. But you can actually boil and cook your stew or something that way without ruining your birch bark if you've got good, like the good solid heavy birch. These things here, canned luncheon meats, they're really handy. The disadvantage, of course, is the weight of the can, and there's still a lot of moisture in there, so that's pretty heavy. That probably weighs, well, it says it weighs 340 grams plus the weight of the can, so it's probably a half a pound there. But it's a good way to take preserved meat, which is one of the harder things to carry around, without concerning yourself with, with spoilage and so on. So a couple of these, if you can, again, carry the weight, that's a handy thing to have. Set that to the side. Getting into the pouch here, I'm going to save the salt here for the last. I want to talk a little bit more about that salt. This is a pre-made bannock mix. Basically, bannock is a unleavened bun or bread or whatever from back in the fur trade days in North America, Canada particularly, I guess. Basically, it's just, I use unbleached white flour. To each cup of flour, there's probably a teaspoon of baking powder, a little bit of salt. If you want to, now I just carry it like that, and all you need to do is scoop some out, put a little bit of water in it, and you make yourself your bannock in your frying pan or on a stick. You've seen that in a couple of my videos in the past. And then when you start to mix this up, you can always add things to it. If you've got blueberries or raisins or anything else that you want to use to flavor it, cinnamon, anything you want to put into it, you can add that in. And I usually save that until the point of actually making it, so that so I don't have to make it all exactly the same. I can have variety. So there's that. A pretty good staple that everybody knows is rice. So again, that's a lot of food. Like this container here, as you can see the size of it, if you fill this up with the proper food sources, you can go for weeks. A single person can go for weeks on the amount of food that's in here and eat reasonably well. You know, you can't sit there and stuff yourself, but you can certainly eat well. Another thing that's a big thing that I use a lot is these are the dehydrated vegetables. I used to dehydrate my own, but because when I first initially looked at these things, and they were like 12 bucks a pound to buy this stuff, and I thought, boy, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying that much money. But it doesn't weigh anything. If you were to pay 12 bucks and get a pound of this stuff, you'd fill this whole bloody tub with it. I mean, this stuff is just, there's nothing to it. So that's another thing that is just extremely light, and it really, really reconstitutes in a bigger form. Like one heaping tablespoon of this reconstitutes into a pretty decent serving. So if you took, say, a couple of tablespoons of rice, a heaping tablespoon of this stuff, whatever, and then maybe made some bannock and so on. Now in here I also have, that's more dehydrated veggies. These, I'll get back to that in a minute. These are dehydrated mushrooms. Now these are mushrooms that I purchased. I got quite a large container of them for a reasonable price. And they came in fairly big chunks, so I just broke them up. And there's very little weight there. And I have some ground meat here somewhere, I think. There's dried tomato. I've dehydrated that myself. Soup mix. I bought that. But there's some good soup mix. Here's something else I've made myself, dehydrated green peas. You can see how much stuff is coming out of this container here. There's a lot of stuff in there, and quite a few meals. Let me just start piling this up here. We'll get an idea. There's our tomatoes, dehydrated tomatoes. This is another one that I've dehydrated myself. That's corn, dehydrated corn. And again, there's just, once it's dehydrated, there's no weight to this. It's like making jerky. It takes 4 pounds, or perhaps slightly more than 4 pounds of raw meat to get 1 pound of jerky once you've taken all the moisture out of it. This stuff is the same. Like this whole bin here hardly weighs, maybe 5 or 6 pounds. Now I've got a lot of other stuff in here because I wasn't actually using this right away. I was just storing it. But we come from a being used to having lots of flavor, and that's pretty common with all the cooking that we do. If we're in a situation where we're out there and we're starting to switch over to eating wild game and so on, that's going to be a pretty big transition. So I like to carry some spices. This is a mesquite chipotle blend. I love my chipotle. I believe this one was from Cabela's. I normally make up my own spices, but this is a good one. And any other spices that suit you. You get the point. There's all kinds of garlic. There's all kinds of little bits and pieces. This is mustard powder. Now mustard powder goes really good on most meats and things, so I like to have that around. And then I have a couple of other containers. This one is just plain Le Grill. That's a smoked applewood type flavor. So again, you get the point. There's all kinds of these things that you can add in here. And also I have a small container of olive oil. Again, when you're using enough, you have enough of that, you're pretty well off. So, as you can see, there's an awful lot of food in a pretty small container here. And, by the time you rehydrate this, for a single person, like for a single serving, and it doesn't matter how many people you have in your group, but as a single serving, about a heaping tablespoon of each of these things. So if you took peas, vegetables, a little bit of the mushroom, some of the corn, or some of the soup base, some rice, and took a tablespoon of each and rehydrated that, cooked it up in some boiling water and rehydrated all that, you'd end up with, as you can imagine, a pretty substantial meal. So you're certainly not going to starve to death by carrying this stuff. And the beauty of it is, You can take a lot of it with you that has very, very little weight. One way that I like to carry it is, slide this over a bit, are in these bins. These big totes here are handy as anything. This particular one, let's turn it around here. I don't remember when I got this. It was a long time ago, but Kalamata olives came in this in brine. So this was delivered from probably across the ocean from Greece or someplace. So, you know, since I travel in canoes or even in snowmobiles and so on, if this ever fell in the water, even if you had all these materials and products in here, there would be enough air there that it would still float. So it's a great way to carry stuff. It's just like a hard version of a dry bag, really. So there's all of our materials, our foods, and as I said, there's enough food here in this kit. And I have some dehydrated ground meat here, which apparently isn't in the kit at the moment. I'm not sure why. It usually is. But at any rate, you just take ground meat. Take the lean ground meat. The problem with anything that you want to take, even if you dehydrate it, any food that you want to store for a long time, if there's any fat in it, it can go rancid. So these things can sit, there's no refrigeration. This stuff just sits on the shelf for, you know, for years probably, and it would be fine. And in addition to that, you're going to supplement that with whatever you can catch and hunt for, and you know, so hopefully you'll have some fish, and even if it's all small game, you get, you know, some fish, some rabbits, whatever else. There's just enough food there to carry you on for a long time. The reason that I left the salt till the end is because, in my opinion, you want to take as much salt with you as you can possibly carry. You pretty much want to have most of that salt, at least the majority of it, as non-iodized. And there's good reasons for that, which we're going to get into here. But salt is a very difficult resource to get in nature. But if you're very fortunate to live close to an ocean, or where you could migrate to the ocean on a pilgrimage once a year or something and dehydrate salt water and you know, stay for a couple of weeks until you'd acquired enough salt to take back with you to wherever you're going, that's not really an option for me here. It's all, I mean, the James Bay isn't that far away, but it's all muskeg and nonsense in between, so not a good trip. So salt will be used for tanning hides. It's good for, obviously for cooking, needless to say. Preserving things like salting fish and so on, or meat or anything else if you have no other way to preserve it and you need to do something right away. So salt has a ton of uses for that sort of a thing, and because it's a very difficult resource to resupply with, you know, my recommendation is take a lot of salt. So we'll move on now. This is basically just touched on what we're going to take with us during that transition period, and also to give us sort of a comfort food sort of a thing while we're starting to adapt to eating just what we can get from the land. Well, there are, of course, you know, many ways to acquire food in the natural environment. There was just a momentary bit of history here to start this off. About 10 or 12,000 years ago, after the Younger Dryas, which was a sort of a brief ice age in Europe, the area between Iran and Iraq was at that time called the Fertile Crescent. It was very rich, and you know, the land and the soil was good for growing and crops. That was about the time when most humans went from being hunter-gatherers and became more into the farmers. And one thing that they found as they kind of got drawn into that was that, well, the big thing that they discovered was the natural grasses, which would be the precursors to our wheat and so on. And it wasn't as productive because we've genetically modified it and whatever. But at any rate, there was still a lot of food content in what was available. Researchers have sort of reenacted and studied what they would have used in terms of primitive tools, sickles with blades made out of flint and so on. And they found that one person harvesting these grasses for 1 month, 8 hours a day, so one working day, could supply and store up enough food for a family of 4 for an entire year. So the point of all this, I think those people were the Natufians, is what they called them. An archaeologist named Dorothy Garrett was the one that sort of originally discovered that. And the point is that they found that they could supply themselves with vast amounts of food for a relatively minimal amount of work. So again, supplementing that with hunting and meat and so on, they had a really pretty good nutritional diet going on there. So what that means to us is that a source of gardening in a survival situation, in a long-term situation, can supply us with a vast amount of food for a relatively minimal amount of effort. So one of the things that's critically important, in my opinion, to carry with you would be a selection of seeds, and make sure that the vegetable seeds that you're carrying are, of course, obviously are appropriate to your area where you live, your growing conditions, temperatures, soil types, and everything else. That goes pretty much without saying. But that is going to be a huge portion, not only of your food bulk amount, but also of a balanced and nutritional diet. Now, you can pick up berries and Labrador tea and rose hips in my area, and other items like that, service berries, and so on and so on and so on. But they're very seasonal, and you're just not going to get enough of it in order to get enough of a balanced diet going on to keep yourself fit, healthy, and supply the energy that you're going to need in order to perform all the other multitude of tasks that are going to be involved. Shelter building, firewood collection, it just goes on and on and on. Yes, I know. See, the boss here says so too. So something like that is something that you really have to keep in mind. So there are a few tools that you're going to want to carry. Now, I didn't put these into the tool video because they're quite specific to this gardening, and I wanted to kind of package this together. But certainly a hoe, a shovel, whatever various bits and pieces of tools, probably a bucket or something, which you hopefully will have anyways in order to carry water. The seeds themselves, obviously a good selection of fresh seeds. Don't get something that's been around. Very definitely get seeds that are, they're not these genetically modified things that they've got nowadays. Make sure that you get the heirloom seeds, which reproduce not only better quality and better flavor, but they also reproduce true to the seed. So when you get seed saving from your first or second or third harvest, you can save those seeds and replant them in the future in the next season and get the same product again, which you don't often do. Well, with some of these genetically modified ones, they've deliberately killed the seed so that you can't even regrow it, forcing you to purchase a new seed. If they've killed the element of the seed so that it won't regrow, then they've probably killed a vast amount of any value and nutrition that the seed had in it in the first place. These foods that you will grow, and that a lot of us grow even now at home, are going to be a lot healthier for you to eat. And the reason I say that is that nowadays, when they are preparing to market food to us, they're not the least bit concerned with the quality of the food in terms of nutritional value, making sure it has its maximum amount of nutrients and so on in it. The companies now, like everything, are concerned only with dollars and specifically profit margin. They have modified and crossbred and even genetically modified these food products, right down into including the meat and everything from the cattle and whatnot, to have good color, not even necessarily good taste, but to have storability in terms of being able to, for example, harvest fruits and vegetables that we get here in far north of Canada here, that come from the Middle East and Europe and so on. They've traveled thousands of miles to get here because they simply don't grow in our climate. So whenever we're getting star fruit or all kinds of plantains and things like that that just simply don't grow here. And even on the items that do grow here, like tomatoes and lettuces and so on like that, they only grow here in a very short period of time in terms of a season. So even still, they're shipped up from the U.S. So we get oranges and lemons and all that kind of thing. And those are specifically tailored or engineered, as a matter of fact, to be able to withstand a long period of time from the time that they are harvested till the time that they actually travel that distance, get to the local supermarkets. The supermarket gets it to the public on the shelf, and we get it at home and want to use it. It could be days, if not weeks, from the time that these things were harvested. So often as not, they're harvested green in some cases. I know bananas are even gassed in order to, I don't know what the gas is they use, but they're gassed in order to make sure that they arrive at the right period of time and the right level of ripeness. So this is all something that we should probably be aware of long before we ever think about having to bug out somewhere. But I'm not going to get into all that. So let's, any more than I already have, because that gets me kind of going here a bit. But going on to getting food from the land, we're going to use a variety of different methods, depending again on where you live. There will be fishing. Now fishing is a lot of different things. It can be your typical fishing rod fishing, which is time consuming on your part, which means you're not able to do anything else while you're fishing. And productivity can be either good or not so good, again, for the amount of time you spend. But then there are nets, which you can set. And that's a way that these nets will work all the time, whether you're there or not. From the time you've set them, you go back, that night or the next morning or whatever the case is, and your net's been working 24/7 while you're out doing other important tasks as well. The same with trot lines or landlines or whatever that you would tie off to a branch of a tree and have that line cast out into the river or the lake, so that again it's sitting out there for hours and hours overnight, whatever the case may be. This works in the wintertime too, having lines down through the ice and coming back and getting them hours later. And these things will allow you to have 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 lines out. Now that's not legal in most cases under normal circumstances. So you really take this with a grain of salt. This isn't suggesting that you go out and do this. Be aware that there are local laws, and they're all different. I mean, there are local laws in Ontario that vary from one part of another to another part of the province, and certainly other countries, other states, and wherever will have their own laws. So be absolutely certain. The onus and the responsibility is on you to make sure that you find out about these laws and don't get yourself mixed up in any trouble, because they take that pretty seriously. Certainly here, anyways. I mean, you don't want to take a species or something out of season or illegally, or you're really in big trouble. But in a situation where it's a survival situation, you have to make allowances, and in most cases, under those circumstances, there probably isn't any sense of law enforcement, anyways, because that's why you're out there. So that's one way to look at it. Make sure that you've got things working for you so that you don't have to do this yourself constantly. And the same goes for procuring other types of food materials and so on. Hunting is one way to do it, by all means. Now, these videos are relatively short. I know it seems long when you're watching them, but I can't possibly go through a lifetime of experience and learning in a 30-minute or a 40-minute video. It just can't be done. There's just thousands of different aspects to this that that you just have to get out there and learn, or apprentice, or with a mentor, a parent, a cousin, an uncle, a friend, somebody who can help teach you the ropes. You can learn it without doing that. Mostly I did, but it's a long time and a time-consuming thing to trial and error it when hopefully you can get somebody to help you out. I'm not going to go into firearms and things like that, because for if you take 10 people and put them in a room and ask them what the best gun is for any particular purpose, you'll get 11 answers, because there's always somebody sitting on the fence that they don't really know. So, you know, that's a personal thing. And again, it depends. You know, if you're in an area like where I am, where there's heavy bush, you don't really need a rifle that shoots a great long distance with a very flat trajectory. We're not going to get 1,000-yard shots here, which are not particularly ethical anyways, but nevertheless, you know, 50 to 100 yards would be, 100 yards is a long shot around here. That would be across a pond or something like that, because the bush is just so thick. Often it's 50 feet. But then on the other hand, if you're in a very open prairie type area or in a mountainous type area where you might be shooting from the side of one mountain to the side of the mountain across from you, you might very well need a flat shooting powerful rifle that can shoot accurately at 400 and 500 plus yards, because that's just the way it's going to have to be. That means that there's a huge responsibility on your skill level to be able to even do those sorts of things. So that's a lot to be taken into consideration. As far as the actual hunting goes, again, you know, stealth and being scent free as much as you possibly can, you know, those are things that are pretty standard. Most people would probably understand that quite easily. The only thing I can suggest is, in terms of actually being able to go out and hunt, is to hunt the edges. That would be the single best piece of advice that I can give you, is hunt the edges. What that means is, very rarely will you find animals, unless they're hiding because of the pressure of a hunting season, which probably won't be the case when, you know, in a circumstance that we're talking about. They're not likely going to be in the deepest, densest, darkest part, because there's very little food sources in areas where there's heavily shadowed areas, and there's just not a lot of plants to grow that most animals would find that they can eat. So when I say hunt the edges, I'm basically saying the edge of light, which would be basically that short period of time between dark and dawn. You know, animals tend to move in those time frames more than they do during the day. They can move anytime, so don't limit yourself, but just keep that in mind. And the edge of darkness is the same thing. That last golden hour of sunlight, from the time it's just starting to get dusk until it's too dark to see, is probably one of the very best times to be out hunting. So hunt the edge of light, the edge of morning light as it comes on, the edge of darkness as the light fades in the evening. Hunt the edges of transitions from of the geography. So if you're hunting an area where there's a heavy bush area, a relatively heavy bush area, where that transitions into open ground and open field type or more open field type area, a lot of times the animals will be transitioning from a bedding area in that denser area to the field in order to go out there and get the softer succulent plants that they eat. So those transitions, the edge of a change in cover, is a good place, and always to look for tracks, look for trails, and if you're going to set up a stand or whatever. So hunt edges of changes in cover like that. Hunt edges of a change from land to water. Again, a lot of animals will cruise along more or less along the shoreline of a river or a lake. Sometimes it's a few meters back a few yards back into the bush, but generally speaking, they'll be reasonably close to that area, because again, they can travel often more easily along the shore of a river, because it's probably more open than the bush and brush and willows and everything that surrounds it. But also there's often a better opportunity for them to score a meal in an area like that. And sometimes what they eat is a water type plant, like moose for example, so they're going to be in that type of area. So this I can't go on through this whole thing. There just isn't amount of time. But keep that kind of thing in mind. Learn these things, learn how to do it, learn how to move with a bit of stealth and so on. And those things will be of a vast bonus to you. A lot of times the best thing to do is just find a good spot with something of a view on one of these edge areas where you're overlooking the edge of a field or the edge of a lake or whatever the case may be, and just find a place to get hunkered down in there, sit down, build yourself a little blind with branches and whatever, and just sit there and wait. If you've scouted around as you should have and found trails that the animals are using to come out into these areas, and you can set yourself back a little ways, you're in good order that way. As well as firearms, a backup system that I use is bows. You know, you're never going to run out of ammunition. You can always make another arrow. You can, you know, you can fletch it with feathers off of whatever partridge, duck, goose, crow, whatever else you've managed to harvest. You can, as we spoke about in the tools section, you can hammer new arrowheads out of, you know, car hoods or any other piece of metal that you can come up with. And arrow shafts, you know, find a straight dogwood or willow or something like that, branch that's the right size, form it slightly while it's green over the heat of a fire, above the fire, so that you can get it straightened out, so that when it dries, you know, it's going to dry as straight as possible, and you can make yourself a lot of arrows, just for the sake of sitting around the campfire one evening after dark and just spending your time doing that, you know. These things are, now these are active hunting methods where you actually have to be out there doing it. Same with ducks and geese, you know, you're going to be out there with your firearm of whatever the choice is, possibly even a net submerged in the water, and you're going to be out there. But these are active hunting times where you're going to be requiring your time to be doing it. So back to the same analogy as using nets for fishing or bank lines and trot lines and all that sort of a thing. There are ways of acquiring your meat as far as hunting without actually having to be there in the same fashion. Okay, so when it comes to acquiring food on land, basically, again, we want to go with the same scenario where we don't have to be physically out there every moment, because it can tie up a great deal of time. Often the case is that you will get more food from a variety of smaller game than you will from a single large animal like deer, or even larger would be caribou, moose, elk, that type of thing. If you do get one of those larger animals, you have a vast amount of meat at one time, which is good as long as you can preserve it without any loss. So that would depend on, again, back to the salt that we might have had with us. You might pack fish in salt. You might dry it. As far as you know, moose meat or something, you could certainly make jerky out of a great deal of it. That reconstitutes very nicely, and it stores easily. You know, 4 1/4 pounds of raw meat drops down into 1 pound of dried meat as far as jerky. Excuse me. So that can be put back into a soup or something that rehydrates and is quite useful and still retains its nutritional value. However, staying with the smaller game type of idea, and don't discount. It's not just, we're not talking rabbits here. We're talking, I eat beaver frequently. It's excellent. Muskrat is very good. These things are really good. There's a good nutritional value in it. The flavor's good. So don't discount those. Turtles and all sorts of other animals like that, which are something that we want to use because they're readily available generally in large quantities, as compared to one moose per 5 square miles. There might be 40 or 50 beaver in that same area, depending on the circumstances. So how we achieve this is basically by trapping. Now, I'm not discussing here the implications or the, you know, of whether you like to trap or don't like to trap, believe in it or don't believe in it. I am not a fur trapper. I don't kill for a pelt or whatever, just for to sell. I'm not judging anybody who does that. Their circumstances are quite different than mine, no doubt. I don't need to do that, therefore I don't do that. However, I do know a lot about it. I've been around it. I have friends who trap, and it's a really excellent way of, again, having the trap out there working 24/7 when you're not having to be right there at that moment. You can be out doing something else productive, like working on your garden or whatever the case may be. So these types of traps here, this is quite a small one. Usually when you change the size number of a trap, it changes the dimension of the opening here when it's opened. In this particular case, a 120 has a single spring on it, and the 110 has a single spring on it, and the 120 has a double spring on it. A little bit unusual in the way they've marked these, but that's just the way it is. This would be a very good sized trap for muskrats and so on like that, rabbits even, anything of that caliber you could easily enough get in here. the size of the trap and its ability to catch something is judged not as much by the power of the springs, although that's obviously important, but by the size of the opening here, because if the animal can't get its head in here, then it's not really going to get caught. So these are primarily traps that catch the animal by the head and neck. They kill them essentially instantly, so there's not a lot of suffering. That's just the way it works. If you know, when you need to supply food. This is a little bit bigger one. This is a brand new one. Where I live here, there's no law that says that you have to have a license to own these traps. I can own as many of these traps as I want. I just can't go out and use them in a trapping situation unless I have a trapping license. But I can have them, so therefore they're a handy thing to have around. Now this one is a 220. This would be, it's folded up here, they unravel. This is, like I said, it's brand new, so I'm going to have to unravel it. But the arms swing out the same as the other one did. As you can see, it's quite a bit bigger, a lot stronger in the springs here. And you could very easily take animals the size of raccoons, possum, foxes, not so much coyotes, because again, it's a bit too small for that. There have been instances where people have used these traps and set them on a flatter platform, and you can do a dirt hole set or something like that and catch an animal by the leg. It's not what they're designed for. It's not the best way to do it. If it works, you know, meat is meat, but probably not the best way. One thing, before I put this down, one thing I'm going to tell you about, these things can hurt you. Okay? Perhaps I'm not suggesting for a second that people run out there and grab traps and start practicing with them. It comes right back to our laws in every area that I am aware of governing whether you can even own these things, and certainly about where and when and how you can use them. There are trapping seasons the same way there are hunting seasons. So don't go running out there just saying, well, you know, I was told I could do it on a video. That's not the case at all. All I'm saying is that these are a viable way of acquiring meat. I'm not saying that there's, you know, it's right or wrong in your area, but we're also going back to the survival situation where we laws have sort of broken down and we're out there trying to get ourselves something to eat in a desperate situation where we're trying to keep ourselves alive. But learn from somebody. There are courses you can take if you want to get involved with that. Learn from somebody how to handle these things. They will hurt you. These things can break your fingers. They can kill your pet, you know, just as easy as they can kill the target animal that you've got. They're indiscriminate. They'll kill anything that sticks its face in there. So, you know, you really, really have to have a huge amount of responsibility when you're handling these things. Those will hurt you. This one will bust you up. This thing here is a 330. This is the size that they use for beavers. It's about 11, almost 12 inches square. This will break your arm for you. These things are nothing to fool with. They're an excellent tool like any other tool, but they can have their dangers simply because, you know, they're traps. You can get yourself snagged up in one of these things if you're not very careful, and I'll tell you something, man, you know, you're in a hurting situation there. Not only that, but if you happen to be alone, or even if you're just out on your trap line alone, and you get yourself hung up in one of these things, and you're stuck in there, and you can't get out, you've got to, you know, it's mangled up your arm, possibly broken it, depending on, you know, if you've got a heavy enough coat to pad you, but that may not help. So now you're stuck in this thing. Now these things, look at the size of the steel on that. Look at that's probably almost 3/8 of an inch. These things are tough. You can't begin to compress this spring set here even a little bit, not even the tiniest bit by hand. Now there is a kind of a plier type tool that you use to hook onto these jaws, onto the spring arms, and you can lever them closed. You can buy those. They're easy to buy. They're not terribly expensive. I made my own because I do those things. But you know, if you get caught in one of these traps, those tools require two hands. Like you know, they're big. And you're not going to be able to do that if one of your arms is jammed up in this thing and you know, you're all hung up in there. So there is a method where you have a rope. It's very similar to the rope that would be, it's a tough rope and it can have a little T-handle on it, something similar to what you would have for pull starting you know, a lawnmower engine or something, that type of thing. And you can hook it onto this one-handed and you can release yourself from this trap with one hand. Learn how to do that and have that rope in your pocket. It's no good for you if it's in the sleigh or in the pack that's leaned against a tree 20 feet away. These things are generally anchored to, you'd have to anchor this to a tree so that if the animal did happen to get caught in there and wasn't killed, it's not going to run away with your trap. These are not cheap. They're not horribly expensive, but they don't give them away either. So have that thing in your pocket at all times, especially when you're working with these big guys, because, I just can't tell you how much or how often I can say it, that these things can be dangerous if you're not really, really cautious and fairly well trained or familiar with how they work. But they do a super good job. If you had, say, 2 or 3 this size, and I would say that these 220s are this will actually take, a fox, a coyote, might even take a wolf. Wolves are pretty smart. They probably won't stick their head in there, but if they did, you could probably take a wolf with it as well. But certainly anything from, coyotes and bobcats and lynx and anything in that size range, you'll get. These 220s are pretty universal size. They'll take a lot of animals from raccoon size and so on. There is another size somewhat lower than this, which is a 160. That's also a very good universal size. You can use that for a big variety of the smaller animals that we get around here. So again, smaller coons, some possums, that type of thing. And then these little guys, which are certainly a lot less expensive and a lot easier to deal with, you can also get, have several of these and get smaller items like raccoons and rabbits and all that sort of a thing. They have a little safety hook. Now, when you're buying these traps, buy a good quality one, because not only is the quality in whether it's riveted here or how they put them together, but it's also these little safety hooks. When you compress this spring, that hook, when you compress the spring, this little hook part here, right there, hooks on this bottom, and there's one on each side. There should be. There isn't one on here for some reason. But they will hook on there, and that is the safety. And the reason they have that is so that when you're setting these traps, as you set the trap, you compress the springs, and you set the dog on the trap, and it's all ready to go. You hook this safety on so that as you're putting the trap in position and and putting a little bit of grass and stuff around it to hide it, you're not going to set it off and whack yourself with it. Once you've got it set, then you can just slip this little safety catch off, slip it out of the way, and the trap is ready to go. And that's important with all of these different size traps. But and you can see that on this one here, it's a whole lot heavier duty right there. That's a flat bar. They're quite strong. There will be one for each side. There's a second one over here, so there's one for each spring. By goodness, and for this one here, absolutely, as we can see, again, that much bigger and heavier duty again. Make sure you use those things. Now, if you forget to take them off, the worst that's going to happen is that the animal will come in through the trap and the trap won't fire off. So you've lost an opportunity, but nobody got hurt. But make sure you use those things, and you learn, like I said, learn how to operate these traps safely, because those big ones, man, they'll hurt you. So that really covers most of what we wanted to talk about in a relatively short video like this. It boils down basically like every skills, learn how to hunt, learn how to take care of the animal when you've got it, learn how to clean it and butcher it and skin it, utilize the hide, how to preserve the meat once you've got it, learn how to fish and set nets and set land lines and trim limb lines and everything else. It's a wise idea to learn how to use these traps and have a few of them around. And that is a really good way to maintain a good supply of meat coming in. And in addition to your gardening with your heirloom seeds, you should have an abundance of food, as long as nothing, unexpected happens, and you never know. But anyway, so that pretty much concludes what we're talking about today, the most I can tell you in a short period of time. I want to thank you for joining me again. If you've enjoyed this series, if you can think of something else that I haven't covered, or make suggestions that I haven't thought of to put in here, like I said, there's only so much I can fit into a reasonable time frame. by all means, leave them in the comment section. I'm always willing to listen. We can all learn, no matter how much experience we've got, no matter who out there already does all these things. You know, we all learn from each other because everybody's got slightly different experiences, little tricks and things that make things easier. So if you've enjoyed this, please share it with somebody else so that they can get some benefit from it as well, hopefully benefit. I've enjoyed spending the time with you as always. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. Share it with anybody else that might also be interested. Everybody have a safe day and a great week. We'll see you all down the trail next time. Have a good one.